Okay, now we're starting with the subject matter. That took, unfortunately, it took a few minutes. But I'm expecting to go about 1 hour for the class part. So the question of the day is this: who are the Germans and where did they come from? Who are the Germans and where did they come from? So the answer begins, we're starting at the beginning with the Indo-European migrations. And we have a map.
You want it now?
Yeah.
Okay.
You go to the map here. There, the Indo-European migrations began in this, here's a good map. Right in the center of it, you see that greenish gray area, a blob. That is the area which became overpopulated. Actually, there was a first migration about 4000 BC, but that's irrelevant to the Germans. So there was an overpopulation in that area. Okay, where is it? It's north of the Black Sea and go over, it's north of the Caspian Sea. It fills even a little larger area to the east. But that whole area, which includes, what country is that today? It would be the Ukraine, a little bit of Kazakhstan, both of which are strongly in the news right now. So that is where the Indo-European language group, and Indo-European is a language group rather than ethnic or any other. And so about 1800 BC or BCE, about 1800 BC, people spilled out of that area of the motherland, the homeland of the Indo-Europeans, spilled out in 3 directions: to the north, to the east, and to the west. And the ones who came into Europe, most of the European population came at this time speaking variations of Indo-European. To the north were the Slavic peoples, Polish, Russians, and others. And it included, among the first were the people who came into Greece, Greek language group, and then the Romans into Italy, speaking Latin, eventually Latin, the Celts, the Scandinavians, and the Germanic peoples spilled across. Well, first of all, the Germanic peoples spent several centuries in Eastern Europe. Then they migrated northwest into Scandinavia. So what's now southern Sweden and Norway were, that was the settlement area of the Germanic peoples for several centuries. And then finally, somewhere around 500 BC, 400 BC, they migrated down into Northern Europe, Northern mainland Europe. And you see the word Germans there on the left. So that's when the German peoples migrated finally into their present day territory. So they've been in that area as much as, well over 2,000 years, as much as 2,400, 2,500 years. Also, I mentioned the Slavic peoples who migrated to the north, and then to the right, the Persians, the people that would become Persians, and to northern India. The Sanskrit language was the language of the Aryans, the Aryan people. Given a lot of publicity by the Nazis, Hitler and the Nazis. But the Aryans moved into all across northern India, and their language, Sanskrit, is akin to all these others. So it's kind of interesting how in the world do we know all of this about the language groups? They originate, where they originated and where they went to, because of, well, the science of philology. And it was the British were the ones who managed to learn to really begin the science of philology, the science of language structures and comparative languages. Although Thomas Jefferson was a master of philology, also he loved comparing languages. But fellow's name is Henry Rollinson, an extraordinary Englishman. Henry Rollinson was in the British Foreign Diplomatic Corps, spent years stationed in India and as well as Afghanistan and Persia, that time was still called Persia, today's Iran. And then he was the chief diplomat in Baghdad, but he knew several languages, was very interested in comparative languages. And while he was in Persia, Iran, he learned Old Persian, among other languages that he already knew. He learned Old Persian, and then he learned 3 long extinct languages from this area, from Mesopotamia, not just Sumerian and Babylonian, but 3 languages that most of us have never heard of. He learned those from cuneiform tablets, from cuneiform wedge writings. And he began to see startling patterns. He noticed that many of the vocabulary words in all these languages had a similarity. And for example, just to take one word, the word mother, in what is the Greek word for mother? It's mater. The Latin word for mother, the Roman word for mother is mater. The German word, and many of you can pronounce it better than I, mutter. Mutter is a German word for mother. French word, mère. And what is the Sanskrit word for mother? It's Mataji. And that's only one example of what this extraordinary Henry Rollinson discovered. And then he kept finding other words. So he was able to determine that all these languages, the Indo-European languages, started in the same place, this gray blob in the middle of the map. And Sanskrit, so Sanskrit and Farsi, the Persian language, are cousin languages to our own. Okay. So that is the origin, it's the linguistic origin of the German people, which is spoken then, it's still spoken all across the northern part of Europe. Now, okay, now we're moving on to the geography.
You want me to go to the next map?
For another, so
Back to you.
we're gonna leave this map for a few minutes. The geography of Germany is quite fascinating. And we know that the geography of a people, the geography of a nation, has exercised an influence, a strong influence. In fact, you could say that the geography of some nations have actually determined their history. 2 examples. Whenever we start a new country, a new nation, I like to give two examples of how geography deeply affected a country. We take a look at ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. Let's go to this physical map of Europe. Egypt, of course, we all know the geography of Egypt is basically, not this one, there. Egypt is off the map, but the geography of Egypt is the Nile River, the long, endless Nile River that runs from south to north. And that is 99% of the population, 98% of the population of Egypt is along the Nile River. Now, how did that affect the history of Egypt? As the population built up, and it could, because every year the gift of the Nile was a thin layer of silt that was deposited by the floodwaters, the high waters of the Nile River. So when one area, one village, one town, one region became economically strong, populated, and became a power, one leader from Egypt could send feluccas, could easily send the sailing boats, the ancient feluccas, upriver and downriver. It could send soldiers, anywhere up or down the Nile River. In other words, it was possible for one person, one strong leader, to create an empire along the Nile River. So the geography, the result was that ancient Egypt, civilization lasted for 3,000 years with some sporadic interruptions. But about 3,000 years, there was a large, stable empire. That was a gift. That was the geography. The gift of geography to the Egyptians was that, a large, stable empire for millennia. And now we're going to take a look at Greece, which is on this map, on the Mediterranean, down at the bottom of the map. The geography of Greece, as you can see, is very rugged mountains, sharp, steep mountains running from northwest to the southeast. And if you've been traveled around in Greece, well, especially if you're hiking, you'll know this, that the sharp mountain ranges create a lot of valleys. There are actually 8 mountain ranges that run through the Balkans, down through Greece, and they run into the Mediterranean. They finally go underground, underwater into the Mediterranean Sea. You can see the 3 fingers of the, four mountain ranges of the Peloponnesian Peninsula that go south and finally dive underwater, and also to the east of that. So there are 8 mountain ranges that finally disappear into the Mediterranean Sea. Well, what have they created? They've created a lot of mountain valleys. And so a lot of the villages in ancient Greece were separated from other populations, separated by mountain ranges. So there were hundreds of different villages. Also, take a look at the Aegean Sea. You can't see them here, but there are 1,700 islands in the Aegean Sea. How did that affect the history of Greece? Well, on the islands, of course, most of those 1,700 islands are not inhabitable, but many of them are. And in ancient times, the villages became towns. The polis, the Greek word for the city, polis, of course, gives us words, English words like political. So the islands had many separate city-states also. Some of the larger ones, like Naxos, there was enough population, it was divided into 4 different city-states. Okay, bottom line, in Greece, and you're looking at the physical geography there, it was almost impossible for any one power to conquer or conquer the rest of Greece. In fact, it was impossible. Nobody was able to unify. The Greeks did all speak the same language. They had the same religion, the gods and goddesses, the same mythological culture, the same teacher, Homer, the brilliant Homer, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. So they were one culture, but broken up into several hundred different city-states. And no leader, no ruler was ever strong enough to unify all of Greece. They were notoriously independent of each other. Nobody was able to conquer the Greeks until Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, conquered some of the Greek city-states in the north. And then Alexander the Great himself, before he launched into his unbelievable invasion of Asia, where he conquered all the way to the Indus River in Pakistan. Anyway, so Philip II, who was assassinated at a wedding feast, by the way, and his young son, no more than 20 years old, took over as the king of the Greeks. So bottom line, what was the geography? What was the gift of the geography to the Greeks? Hundreds of separate, independent city-states, small enough that they were able to rule themselves. The Greek city-states could govern themselves, and as a result created the world's first democracy. The democracy that we have, of course, our founding fathers, the 55 founding fathers, almost all of them read ancient Greek and Latin, and they studied the democracy of ancient Greece, and modeled our American democracy, which is, of course, being threatened right now. Our democracy. So that was a huge influence of the ancient Greeks on every one of us today. So now, the contrast between ancient Egypt, that was one long governable population along the Nile River, totally different from ancient Greece, which was hundreds of separate sovereign states, small, tiny sovereign states that were able to produce a democracy. So in both cases, you could say that the geography actually, well, it certainly influenced the Greeks and the Egyptians. You could even say that the geography determined the history of those two countries. Now, moving along to the geography of Germany. What is the geography of Germany? So now we're looking at this. It's a wonderful geophysical map of all of Europe. If you take a glance at Europe, you notice that Southern Europe is mostly a lot of mountains. Spain is almost all mountainous. Southeast France, Switzerland, of course, is all mountains. Much of Austria, Slovenia, the Balkans, the Carpathian Alps in Romania. And take a look at Turkey, by the way, down lower right. Turkey is almost totally a mountainous country, and most of Iran is. You go farther to the east. Good, right in here. If you can, You can see the little white arrow. So the geography of Europe is quite interesting. The southern part is largely mountainous, but go north to Germany. You see what is basically a flat land all the way across northern Germany. Just leave there. And this is called the North European Plain. The North European Plain. And follow it. If you go, it goes in the far west, all from the North Sea. Look at the white arrow there in the North Sea. And so starting with the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, this great the Great Northern Plain. This is, of course, on your outline. The Great Northern Plain. We're going to move slowly across to Germany, Germany's Poland, Belarus, across Russia, and Moscow. Moscow is right about here where the white arrow is. The North European Plain goes past Moscow, hundreds of miles farther to the east until it crashes against this mountain range. What's the name of this mountain range that runs north and south through Russia? Correct. Correct. It's the Ural Mountains. And geographers consider the Ural Mountain Range the dividing line between Europe and Asia. Politically and culturally, most of us see Europe as ending, not including all that, but physically, in terms of geography, this great, the European Plain runs all the way past Moscow, all the way to the Ural Mountains. So that is, and the Ural Mountains is a real barrier. Otherwise, glance all the way across this plain. Much of it is flatland. There's some minor, there's several rivers, minor mountains like in Germany, just 120 miles east, southeast of Berlin. You have the Harz Mountains, beautiful towns there. I learned a lot about the Harz Mountain area towns from John Hawley, who was with us today, who has spent time in Germany. But there's no mountain obstacles from the North Sea all the way to the Urals. There are several rivers, well, notably the Rhine River on the left. It starts, of course, in the Alps and flows down north through the Netherlands. So that's, the Rhine River has been something of a barrier occasionally. But if you look at other rivers going across, you have the Elm River, cuts south of Denmark into the North Sea. The Elm River, you have the Oder-Neisse, which is typically a boundary between Germany and Poland. It is today. And the Vistula River, it's a major river in Poland. You can see it cuts down through the center of Poland. But those rivers don't provide any notable obstacle, no real barrier crossing this plain, this flatland area. Now, how has that influenced the history of Germany? First of all, there are no mountain ranges or oceans as natural barriers to protect a people. Say a nation of people in that broad area have no physical border barricade to protect them from invading armies. So for 2,000 years, there have been a story, the story of the German people has been it's been easy for an alien army to march rapidly into a country like Poland or Germany or the Netherlands, or any power along there that becomes strong enough, they can invade a neighbor going east or west, invade a neighbor with no real obstacle from the physical geography. And that has had a huge influence on German history for 2,000 years. Just a couple of examples while we have this map up. In the beginning of World War II, Hitler's Nazi German army launched their Panzer tanks from Germany into Poland. When September the 1st, 1939, 5 o'clock in the morning, the Nazi army charged rapidly with a blitzkrieg into Poland. And in 3 weeks, it was all over. Poland had been totally occupied and subdued. That is partly because of the geography. No obstacles stopping the German army. And again, jump three years later. The Nazi German army again launched after they had failed, partly Hitler's fault, failed to conquer England. The Germans had conquered virtually all of mainland Europe. Churchill and England is the only country left really that stood alone. So Hitler decided to, after his failure to invade, to destroy the Royal Air Force and invade England, Hitler turned his attention toward the east, toward Russia. He'd always had a strong distaste for the Russians, for the Slavic people. So in 1942, the German army launched rapidly from Germany across Poland, into Russia. The outcome was a disaster, but
For whom?
a disaster for the Germans, for the Nazi German army, and they marched in. Instead of just striking for Moscow, Hitler made a mistake of dividing the attack into three. Anyway, south of Moscow, down here at was Stalingrad. In short, there were no obstacles except the Nazis learned the hard way. The real obstacle was the winters of Russia, the horrifyingly cold, freezing winters, and that helped destroy the German army. And that really was a turning point in World War II. Again, 1945, another example, late 1944, 1945, the Russian army, the Red Army, which had lost millions and millions of soldiers at Stalingrad. That was the biggest weapon that Joseph Stalin had, that the Soviets had, was a huge number of soldiers, even if they were not trained very well, even if they weren't equipped with army tanks. The Red Army marched across Russia, Belarus, Poland, and into Germany, into Berlin. No physical barrier to stop them. So that's three examples just in the 20th century of how the geography of Northern Europe affected the outcome of these enormously important historic turning points. Okay, now we're going to remove this map.
I was on one of the, you want to go back to you?
Yeah. One way to look at that continual flux of borders of Germany. At times, the German state was very wide. We're going to start with Charlemagne's empire. And at other times, at unfortunate times, the borders of German state were very narrow. So what we're going to do now is, well, let's go back to that same map for a moment.
Okie dokie.
One way to look at, I'm going to point out 13 different examples of a metaphor. I'm going to use the metaphor of an accordion. At the time of Charlemagne, it was a huge empire, the biggest empire in almost 1,000 years during the Middle Ages, included much of France, the Belgium, Netherlands, and the Germany. That, if you look on this as an accordion, the accordion was squeezed out to the max. Then, by the time of Charlemagne's 3 grandsons, his empire fragmented, broke up into, it actually shattered. And so as a state, the accordion shrunk in toward the center. Then again, the time of Otto the first Holy Roman Emperor, the boundaries of Germany spread out again. So they look on it as an accordion that expands way out, broad, very wide, broad borders, and then expanded in, squeezed to virtually nothing, no political state. Okay, now we're going to take a look at Charlemagne himself first, and Charlemagne's empire. This is Charlemagne, and one of the most extraordinary leaders of Western Christendom all through the entire Middle Ages. We're going to take a look next at a map of Charlemagne's empire. Now, when was his empire?
Is that it?
No,
Okay. Is that it?
no. There.
Mm,
Actually,
that's good.
yeah, go. Okay, now this map, this shows the huge expanse of Charlemagne's empire. This is about the year 800. His grandfather, Charles Martel, started the state, the Carolingian Empire, but Charlemagne, and he ruled for some about 40 years. Well, actually, it was accurately 45 years. So Charlemagne ruled for 45 years until he died in 814. But he was such a strong, tall, strong, powerful warrior who was also highly intelligent, gifted as a political leader. So Charlemagne managed to conquer all of this area, including half of Italy. It's quite remarkable. And he was crowned emperor on Christmas Day, 800, which added even more prestige that he was anointed by the Pope as emperor. But he had to be on the move all the time, conducting courts. He was the chief judge of the judicial system. But he was extraordinary. So he managed to create this empire. It did not, it was not equaled until 700 years after Charlemagne died. So that's one example of the accordion being extended very widely. Now, let's go to another map.
That one? Okay, good to go back then.
Yeah. But, okay. Okay, we don't have a, let's cut the map.
Cut them out.
Okay, when Charlemagne died, his son was, the succeeding emperor was Louis the Pious, Louis or Louis the Pious. He continued Charlemagne's empire, but it started coming apart very soon because Louis's three sons, this would be Charlemagne's three sons, divided up the empire. Evidently, it was part of the Salish law that the son, well, we'll forget that. Anyway, Louis, Emperor Louis, decided to divide his empire into three separate empires. The ruler of France, the Frankish kingdom, was Charles the Bald. Charles the Bald. Some of these medieval names are not very flattering. Won't even mention Charles the Fat, who was Charles the VI. He's irrelevant here. So Charles the Bald was the king of the Frankish kingdom, which was virtually all of France. And over to the east, Louis the German, Louis the German, he was the king of the Germanies, of the eastern part of the German population. And then in the center, it was something of a mess. The third son, actually the firstborn, Lothair. Lothair, pretty sure these are on your outline. Lothair was the king of the central part, which included Burgundy, Alsace-Lorraine, down to the Mediterranean Sea, Provence. Actually, Lorraine was an important part of it. That's where he made his capital, I believe. But that central part did not have a distinct identity enough to survive. So, and also the two of the brothers fought wars against each other to try to elbow the other out. And the one who was elbowed out mostly was Lothair. So the kingdom of the Franks, future France, expanded at the expense of Lothair. And Louis the German, he was successful in defeating his brother. So the king of the Germans expanded farther into the west. But soon, in the late 800s, Charlemagne's kingdom simply fell apart. Oh, and the next thing happened was a disaster. Let's go to another map of Europe.
Okay.
During the 800s, there were disasters all of Europe. Yeah. So there were a triple disaster that struck the German people in the 800s, especially the late 800s. Namely, the German peoples were invaded from three different directions, from the north, from the east, and from the south. I'm not sure if this is your outline, but from the north, the Vikings, the Danish Vikings in particular, but the Norwegian Vikings, the Swedish and the Danish Vikings all burst out. Of course, there was a population surplus, and if you've done any traveling along the Norwegian coast, you notice the amount of flat land that's usable for growing grain or any crops is extremely limited. So the population outburst created the invasions by the Vikings. The Danish Vikings are the ones who attacked all along the coast. If you look at the arrow, we're going to go from along the coast, right from the Elm River right here, Hamburg, along this coast, all along this coast, all the way down across France. That whole coast was invaded by Vikings and their ships, and they were deadly. They had draft shallow in those famous Viking ships. They could sail up rivers, not only along the coast where they plundered and despoiled virtually every town they came across, and sail up the rivers, up the, one of the most deadly was up right here, up the, into, I'm blanking out on the name of this river that Paris sits on.
Oh, the Loire or the Seine.
The Seine, thank you. The Seine River, you can see the arrow. The Vikings could easily paddle up, but they had one canvas sail. But if they, when they were going up the rivers, they just rowed themselves, paddled up the Seine River to Paris, and they plundered Paris. Well, other towns like Rouen on the way also, but they plundered Paris more than once, and hundreds of other towns all the way from Brittany here, the far west of France, all the way up to the Danish homelands in Denmark. That was totally savaged by the Danish, historians call them Danes in England. So those Germanic territories were brutalized by the Vikings from the north. From the south, we had invaded earlier, was the Arabs and the Berbers from North Africa. Well, from Spain, the Muslims. The Arabs had conquered after Muhammad died in Saudi Arabia. No, not Saudi at all. Arabia. We didn't become Saudi until the 20th century. The chieftain Saud. The Muslims conquered all the way across Africa with a lightning flash, across Gibraltar, conquered virtually all of Spain, except for one valley in the north. So the Muslims, the Mohammedans, Islam attacked halfway up into France to the battle that Charles Martel, the French king, was able to finally stop them there. But they kept a presence right along the French Riviera. The Muslims were there for some time, and also southern Italy. So the Muslims were a threat from the south. Now from the east, could go way out in Central Asia, beyond the map in Central Asia. And this was fairly common for Central Asians to migrate across the Russian steppe. We follow the white arrow there across the Russian steppe, south of the trees, the forest area, the flat land, which had pasture grass up to the belly of the horses. The Mongols took fabulous advantage of that. The Huns had many, and now around the year 800, in the 800s, the Magyars, in English we say Magyars, it's the Hungarians. The 8 tribes of the Hungarians came across and attacked the German people and they marauded all over. They were not united. There were several different tribes, but so they just marauded all over Northern Europe, savaged the German peoples from the east, went down even all the way down and halfway down into Italy. So the Hungarians, and they were mounted. They had lived on horseback, like many of the Central Asian peoples. See, Hungary, and they finally, anyway, so look at what was happening to the German people. They were savaged from the north, from the Hungarians from the east, and Muslims from the south. This was a disastrous period for the German people. It almost extinguished the states of Central Europe. Now, that finally ended. The Vikings were smart enough to figure out that instead of plundering and destroying towns and grabbing plunder, they finally realized that they could earn more money by trading with these towns and have peaceful trade, peaceful or forced trade. So anyway, that the Viking threat calmed down. The Hungarian threat, I'm told by those, we have one Hungarian speaker here, at least, Katie Doran-Nimitz. Her mother was a Hungarian speaker. I believe they call themselves the Magyars. Correct me, Katie, if I'm wrong. The Hungarians finally were defeated by a German ruler, Otto, King Otto I, and he became the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, and he finally was able to scare up enough soldiers, train an army, and finally defeated the Hungarian tribes. And so the Hungarians at that point retreated, and you can see it on this map, the point arrow, into present day Hungary, particularly the plains of the eastern half of Hungary, which is and that's where the Hungarians have been located ever since, around by the year 900. So now look on this as an accordion. The German peoples, their government, their state was shrunk from the north, east, the south, and finally, thanks to Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, it expanded again. In fact, it expanded to include virtually all of Central Europe, which was the accordion from squeezed into the center, expanding very widely. Okay, let's go back. We'll stick with this map again. Now the next, so the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne's map.
Charlemagne's map.
No, we're going to change maps. Otto I, there. This is Charlemagne's empire, but we're going to use this map anyway. The Holy Roman Empire included virtually all of all the German lands there, the central part, going down into Italy, in fact, including southern Italy. So Otto's empire was very large, and it lasted almost 200 years until the rule of Frederick II. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, who died in the year 1250. He had a long rule, about 1200 to 1250. He was a Holy Roman Emperor, but he did not like Germany. That is, it's a place to live. He didn't like the winter, the icy cold winters up there. So he made his camp. He was actually born far south, down in Sicily. You can see a sliver of Sicily is right at the toe. Look at the toe of the boot of Italy, and then to the left there is Sicily. That's actually where Frederick II, Stupor Mundi was his nickname. The wonder of the world. He was an extraordinary person, knew several languages, was very bright, but politically, he caused a disaster. Here's why. Because he disliked being in Germany so much, he liked the sunshine of southern Italy. And he moved his court down to Apulia, it's the heel of the boot, and the area north of there. That area, and even times in Sicily itself. And so he was absent. Friedrich II was absent from his German lands most of his reign. He did rule in Germany for about 9 years of his 38 years as emperor. So what happened when he was absent from the German provinces in the north? What happened was the central authority shriveled because the emperor himself was down in the sunshine, down in southern Italy. Actually, he was quite intelligent in that sense. But because the emperor was not here, the king was gone. So what happened was more and more of the central authority was taken over by the small fries, the rulers of these tiny areas. And there in fact were hundreds of principalities ruled by princes, duchies ruled by dukes, archbishoprics, bishoprics, all kinds of tiny little states, which took, and their rulers took in more and more authority at the expense of the central government. So by the time the Emperor Frederick II died, northern Germany was fragmented, and this had a huge impact on German history. Because what had been, thanks to Otto I, the Holy Roman Empire became shattered into hundreds of little tiny states. And of course, the accordion squeezed in toward the center again. But because of Frederick, the Emperor Frederick, the Germanies suffered a fatal blow. And there was no central government, no real central government in Germany for 600 years. The next 600 years, from the time Frederick died until the year 1871. So from 1250 to 1871, Germany suffered with no central, there was no country of Germany, no state, no German state. There were lots of German peoples all across Northern Europe. They didn't have any central government, no unified Germany. In short, you could say there was no, in this area of the map, there was no United States of Germany. There was no United States of Germany until the 19th century, late 19th century.
You might tell them that.
No. Now there was, in Northern Europe, we're going to use this map still. Look at the Baltic Sea. It runs from Denmark, the yellow Denmark on the left, to the east. All of this is the Baltic Sea. All it goes all the way into the Gulf of Finland. And that way you can reach Petersburg, Russia. I think that's the name of it still, I think it's Petersburg. So that something extraordinary happened in the 1200s, late 1100s into 1200s. That is, many of the port towns along the Baltic coast, that would be the northern coast of Germany here, was that the trade and commerce, seaborne trade, began to flourish. And there were dozens and dozens of towns along here. Lübeck right at the air there, Lubeck was the center, the most important leader of this, became a confederation because the merchants became very successful along the coastal towns, started becoming wealthy, and their ships were attacked by pirates. So in self-defense, they started to join together in what was called the Hanseotic League, the Hanse. And so they joined a confederation. It turned out to be more than 100 tiny cities, really, all along the Baltic coast up to Estonia, Latvia, even Novgorod over in Russia was a member of this, right here. And then expanded also to as far as Bergen in Norway up here. In any case, so there was no political state at all. What it was an economic union, an economic state, a trade union, something like the Eastern, no, right after World War II, the first attempt at a United States of Europe, the European Union, was the what we call the Coal and Iron Confederation. So I've forgotten the exact name, but it was a trade union before the EU, the European Union, was created. Well, that's what you have here in the all along, and it expanded even west of Denmark. Over in this area west of Denmark, you had dozens of members of this confederation, and they were strong enough to repress the pirates, and the towns, many of the towns became very rich with a result of beautiful cities, houses, mansions, guild halls that were where the wealth was spent in beautiful pieces of architecture. And I'm indebted to John Hawley here, who has got numerous pictures of these towns when he and his wife, Charlene Burns, were living in Berlin. She was working as a head nurse at the American embassies. And John spent his time exploring Germany and learning the history and the culture and drinking a lot of beer, German beer. He had a great time. In any case, so there was an economic union. So in a sense, the accordion instrument expanded all the way from parts of Russia, all the way out to, and even London was a member, as well as Bergen in Norway. So economically, you could say the accordion expanded hugely to the east and west, but politically, no, there was no political state. What I'm going to do, what we're going to finish this next time. Go to
You?
Angela.
Angela.
Next time we're going to finish this. Take a look at Martin Luther, Protestant Reformation. That's okay. Martin Luther, Protestant Reformation. Napoleon Bonaparte invading Germany. The unification of Germany. Otto von Bismarck. World War I, World War II. And finally, the rule of the democracy. At post-World War II, Germany, the first chancellor of the Free Republic of Germany was Konrad Adenauer, but we're going to finish up next time with Angela Merkel, a most extraordinary political leader. Her life story is so interesting. I'm going to spend a little time on her next time. But the series of chancellors, starting with not Kurt Waldheim, But Konrad Adenauer. Germany has been a marvel as probably the finest democracy in Europe, very successful economically. That's an amazing success story. And Angela Merkel, who stepped down just almost exactly a month ago after 4 terms serving as chancellor, the first woman chancellor Germany in all of history, and one of the most successful. Okay, now we're going to stop. And if you have any questions, say it again.
There's the chat questions.
Are they? So now, if you have any questions or observations, you can type them into the chat box. Most of you are familiar enough to everyone. Can you fix it?
No.
Okay. Anyway, type in your questions. Can you get the questions?
There are no questions so far.
Okay, so far, apparently we don't have any questions. So if you have a question, take a minute and just type it into the chat box.
Or talk to you now, since not.
Or you can ask.
You can unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and just ask a question.
Okay.
Anybody have an observation or a question? This is very uncharacteristic of you, by the way.
I think it was called the common market. Is that what you were trying to think of?
Oh, thank you. This is Walt Havens. Say it again, Walt.
Called the common market?
Yes, the unification of Europe after World War II. It became the common market. You have the inner 6 countries were the first of the common market, and then the outer 7, which included other states like the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands. And then
when was that?
When was it? The common market, what began even before the common market, there was a first trade group called, it was like the Iron and Coal Alliance or Confederation. And that was probably 1940, in the late 40s or early, very early, around 1950, approximately. The common market itself, I don't remember, but a wild guess, well, some of you probably know.
It was called the Montanunion. Montanunion.
Okay, that's
Montanunion. Union of mountain mining.
Mining?
Well, they sent a delegation to the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. So they were going by then.
Okay.
Was there
at the World's Fair in 1962 in Seattle, who was represented?
The common market.
The common market was.
Yeah,
Okay.
they had a pavilion. It's the first I had been aware of them.
Okay.
Was there any kind of common currency that was used?
Oh, that's a good question. Was there any common currency? Not yet. I can't remember. I was disappointed because the Greek drachma has gone extinct along with the dodo bird. And the lira in Italy. I think the currency, the euro came into existence, I think the same day as the European Union, but I don't.
Yeah,
not sure what
yeah.
year they-
Yes.
But as a little background, there was a long discussion and a debate on what to call the money. And among all the European members, what are we going to call the new money? Can't call them francs or Deutsche Marks. So and one of the serious proposals was to call the money a Charlemagne, the Charlemagne. And that shows how important Charlemagne was to Europeans and to European history.
Interesting.
But they settled on the euro, which
It's a good-
pronounced in French, it's very disappointing, I think. Euro. My French is not very
No.
good. Okay, Diana's going to pronounce it.
No, I can't. Euro. Euro.
Okay, there it is.
Yeah.
It's not much to hear. Okay, any other observations?
How about if we stop the recording now? Can I do that?
Hang on. Okay, we're gonna stop in about a minute if there are no, if we're finished with questions or observations.
Just a big thank you,
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank
Yes.
you.
as usual.
Right,
Thank you.
Thank you.
good.